So in the story of Job, his life that once was happy and full and rich and righteous has been blasted with unbelievable loss and suffering. What once seemed like a good and happy world under a good and just God now seemed like a chaotic and a senseless world, and Job started to get suspicious that God was ruining or was running his universe poorly. That God was up there ruining his life, running everything the wrong way. He thought that God didn't care, that God's not involved, and that God is up there just kind of making our lives miserable for sport. And so Job, in dialogue with his friends, pours out his complaints about God. He tells it like he's feeling it, that God seems to be hunting him, God seems to be shooting his arrows at him. And even if he could speak to God, Job says God would just bully him. He'd just run circles around him. He would just bowl him over. He'd hit him some more. So he doesn't know what could ever come of any of this. Job believed in God's existence, but he no longer trusted him. He no longer had any real relationship with him like he thought he did before. And the great desire of Job's heart was to have that relationship restored, was to get back there again. But for now, it seemed like that relationship was completely gone. And as he suffers, Job says some things that he'll later regret, according to chapter 42, verse 6. But he never gives up on God. He never gives up on that fundamental pursuit of God. He says, this is not how things should go from the way I see things. This is not how the world should be if God is good and God is in control. But in that, he keeps clinging to God. He never says, well, the world's chaotic and therefore there's no God over it. So he says the world is chaotic and therefore I don't understand God. He continues to contend for the faith, even though he's being coached to curse God and die. And so Job's whole story is instructive for us. It's instructive for us when we're suffering and we can't explain it. For all the foolish things that we might think, even sinful things, for all the ways we might sin in our pain, we are called to hold on to God, to seek our relationship with him when he doesn't make sense, and to wait for him. That he's merciful and he's kind and he forgives us as we confess those sinful things that we said or thought and even prayed to him as we went through that suffering. But he wants us to cling to him. He does know what he's doing, and in the end, if we cling to him, we won't be disappointed, though we may be angry and mystified by his ways right now. And so these words that God speaks at the end of the book of Job are some of the ingredients that God mixes into our thoughts to help us persevere in the faith. Because when God comes at the end of this book and speaks to Job, not only is God not a bully like Job said he would be, but he's kind. And God's response to Job is stern for sure. He doesn't let Job get away with incorrect thinking. He reminds Job of Job's smallness and his ignorance of how the world works, and he gently puts Job in his place. But he also draws Job in. He questions him, he answers him like a friend. He points to some real answers for his questions about God's goodness. And God, who didn't have to answer Job, did answer Job. And by extension, he answers us. Because the temptation for us in our despair is to start to see the world the same way that Job saw it. That the world is senseless and chaotic and meaningless. It's all a mess. God's governance of the whole thing is all just arbitrary. And sometimes some of the false promises that we were given by Christians can make the problem worse. Sometimes, depending on what Christian environments we've been in, we may have kind of gotten the message, and maybe they weren't even saying this, but this is what we picked up, that if we followed the rules, if we followed the system, that things would be guaranteed to go well for us. And then we follow the rules, we follow the system, and then when those things don't go well like we expected, we can feel like God isn't governing the world the right way. We can feel like God isn't governing the world at all. And so, for example, maybe we believed that if we parented a certain way, our kids would be guaranteed to turn out great. And there is biblical wisdom for parenting that often bears good fruit, but sometimes it doesn't. And it's easy to think, well, God doesn't run the world the right way because the whole system just didn't work. Or maybe we thought that if we dated or didn't date the right way, that our marriage would definitely be stellar. And again, there are commands from God for purity and wisdom from God on how to handle ourselves in relationships. And often following those things bears good fruit because the God who made the instructions made the world. He knows how things work. But sometimes we do things right, and the outcome isn't what we expected at all. And we can start to think God is cruel, that God is senseless, God is unjust. He doesn't reward the good and punish the bad. The whole thing is just arbitrary, and we can get a little disillusioned or a lot disillusioned with God in situations like that. Or maybe we followed biblical wisdom for managing money. And we were cautious about debt, we were responsible, we were hardworking, and that often does make things go better for us financially. But sometimes there are job losses, and car crashes, and lawsuits, and roof leaks, and health problems that mean that no matter how responsible we are, no matter how many cash envelopes we stuffed, no matter how many debt snowballs we rolled, at the end of it, we weren't any better off. And we can feel like I did all this work, and God is running this world, but he's not running it the right way. Or maybe he's running it the right way for everybody else, but I'm just kind of cursed. And within the Bible, there's this huge body of wisdom literature. There are books like Proverbs that tell us this is wisdom, this is the way the world works, follow this wisdom, follow this system, and things will usually work out. And there are good ways prescribed for us in wisdom literature like that. We're going to spend a lot of time this summer soaking in the book of Proverbs and the wisdom that's there. But there's also wisdom literature like Ecclesiastes and like Job. And they tell us that even when you follow the rules, things don't always work out. Even when you follow wisdom, things can go badly. The creation is not what it should be. It's almost like the car that got in the real big accident and then got repaired, but it was just never right again after that, where it was always just kind of bent and the doors didn't close right. There were always weird noises. It was like they said they repaired it. They said it was better, but it wasn't better. We knew that it wasn't what it once was. And our lives and all of creation can be like that, where things can work, but often they're just racked and bent, and they don't go the way that they should. And in those times when wisdom doesn't seem to work, when following God doesn't work out as far as the results go, in those times when God doesn't make sense, we might think that the way that he rules isn't good or that Christianity isn't valid, and we might just check out on God altogether. We might walk away from the faith altogether because we don't know if he can be trusted. And so God's answers to Job are good answers for us, even though our suffering often is much smaller. And we started looking at some of God's first speech to Job in chapter 38 last week, and some of the elements that we observed that God spoke to Job there for us to remember in our suffering that can help us keep going and help us keep clinging to God are things like, one, God is kinder than we expect or deserve. In the end, God speaks to Job and he answers Job like Job's friends answered him. Two, God is attentive to his creation as the good creator. God walks Job through his creation and reminds him how much wisdom and care have to go into making and sustaining everything. And he gives him this tour of his whole creation from the constellations, the big and far things, down to the clumps of dust that stick together after it rains in Job 38. And he shows him that he cares and he's intricately involved in the whole thing. God shows him that he's far above us and he can comprehend what we can't comprehend. And so even when we go through trials that don't make any sense to us, we're not in a position to be God's judge. These chapters display over and over again his superior power, his superior wisdom, his understanding, his eternality. He showed in these chapters that chaos and evil within God's creation are allowed for a time, but they're limited by God. God confines the sea. He tells the waves where to stop. God's plan is that there is chaos and evil in creation for now, and it's not all neatly judged and neatly eliminated right away, but it is restrained. And that isn't the sum of all creation. It isn't the sum of your story. He also, by walking him through all of creation, shows him that there's still a lot of good in God's creation. God shows Job the beauty and the good that he hasn't been seeing because he understandably is consumed by his trials. And by the way, this isn't a point that the book of Job directly makes, but sometimes going out into God's creation, taking in the beauty, taking in the grandeur is a helpful reminder of God's goodness. It reminds us of our smallness. Sometimes just the walk in the woods or a day at the ocean can hit reset on our focus on ourselves and our focus on our problems, because God has revealed a lot of who he is and what he's doing in his creation. And also in these passages, you can see that God limits not only evil in the world, but he also limits evil people. That they have the night when they can kind of go and do their damage, but every day, every morning, he sets the dawn in its place, turns the lights on to at least press pause on their evil for another day. And so we pick up in chapter 38. There are definitely are parts of this that we're skipping just because of the length of it all, but God is continuing to walk Job through his creation to show him his care, his order, his plan, his goodness, his continued rule over everything. God's world is not what Job has come to believe it is, and God is not who Job came to believe that God is. And so Job 38, verse 22, God's speaking, and he says, "Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? What is the way to the place where the light is distributed, or where the east wind is scattered upon the earth? Who has cleft a channel for the torrents of rain and a way for the thunderbolt, to bring rain on a land where no man is, or the desert in which there is no man, to satisfy the waste and the desolate land, and to make the ground sprout with grass? Has the rain a father, or who has begotten the drops of dew? From whose womb did the ice come forth, and who has given birth to the frost of heaven? The waters become hard like stone, and the face of the deep is frozen." And one important note on this passage to help us know how to interpret it is that anytime we're interpreting a biblical passage, it's important for us to know what genre it is, or what type of writing it is. Because the temptation can be that we read through a passage like that and we can say, this is just a bunch of ancient nonsense. Like, haven't we moved past all this? I mean, don't we know that there is no storehouse for snow up in the sky somewhere? Like, haven't we come to a place where we understand weather better than that right now? We know that there's no womb for ice. We know that nobody gives birth to frost. The Bible's just this bunch of ancient nonsense. This is the way people thought back then, but we've moved on. We don't think this way at all anymore. But it's important to recognize the genre of the text, the type of writing that it is, because that actually affects the meaning of the text. And what I mean is that within the Bible, there are different types of writing. There's historical narrative, where God's just telling a story as it happened. There are letters that are written, there's poetry that's written, there's spooky apocalyptic texts, and the type of writing that part of the Bible is affects the meaning of it. We don't interpret all texts the exact same way. One author explains this difference by saying that in the newspaper, if you remember newspapers, there are a couple different types of genres. There can be classified ads, and there can also be scientific articles. And if you're reading through the classified ads and the headline says steel sinks, you know that means that somebody is selling stainless steel sinks, that someone's selling steel sinks because that headline says steel sinks. But if you're reading through a scientific article in the same newspaper and the headline is steel sinks, that means something different. And the meaning is actually conveyed in part by the type of writing that it is. It means something different when it's written in a classified ad than it does when it's written in a scientific journal. And within the book of Job, there are a lot of different genres actually right within this one book, but this part here where God is speaking is clearly poetry. And you do read poetry differently than you would read a science textbook. And there's a big difference between a poem about roses and a book on botany. And both are good and both have their place, but they serve different purposes. They're both true, but we interpret them differently based on the type of writing that they are. We know that a poem aims to convey a certain feeling and it's less concerned with scientific accuracy, whereas a book on botany is analyzing, and it's not concerned at all with how you feel. I mean, nobody reads a book about botany to be moved emotionally. And nobody looks up poems about roses for gardening tips. Like we know that those different genres are meant to convey different things. And so how we interpret passages of the Bible is affected by what type of writing that it is. And this also says something about the vastness of God, that all of these different forms of literature have to be used to describe him. That he didn't give us a Bible that was just a list of propositions and truth claims about God, but he gave us historical narratives and poems and wise sayings and songs and letters and eyewitness accounts and prophetic warnings and spooky apocalyptic literature. He uses all of these different forms of language. If the universe can't contain him, certainly our words can't. And so God uses all kinds of human language and forms to help us understand just a little bit of his magnificence. And the forms themselves are part of the meaning. Now, we have to be careful not to misuse this idea. I mean, what some people will do is they'll come to a part of the Bible where it describes something that's pretty fantastic, pretty miraculous, and they will say, well, that must just be poetry, so we're not going to take that literally. But you've got to be honest about the form of what you're reading. You know, for example, there's nothing poetic about the accounts of Jesus rising from the dead. That's clearly written as a narrative. It's written as an eyewitness account. So there's nothing in that text that should make us say, well, this is just a poem, this is just verse, so we're not going to take it literally. We take it literally, even though it's unbelievable that someone rose from the dead. But then when we do read something that's clearly poetry, we know that we interpret it in a different way. So when we read this passage in Job, we don't have to read about that storehouse for snow and take it literally. It's a poetic line couched in a poem, and it conveys a feeling and a meaning, and it doesn't pretend to describe a literal place. So there is no storehouse for snow up in the sky somewhere. And the Bible is true. Every word is inspired by God. This is true poetry. And if we try to take a hyper-literal approach to poetry, we actually can end up doing some damage. On the one hand, we could say, well, I just got to get rid of the Bible altogether because we know there's not a literal storehouse for snow. We have to dismiss this whole thing. But that would be unwarranted because it's not making a scientific claim here. This is a poem. Or we could spend a lot of time trying to somehow defend the existence of a literal storehouse of snow up in the sky, because we believe that a wooden literal interpretation has to apply to every single text of the Bible. It would be like trying to interpret every type of writing like it is a book on botany. But if we do either one of those things, we'll miss what this is saying. And so again, look at chapter 38, verse 22 and 23, because what it's saying is so much better than just making a claim about where God keeps the snow. He says, have you entered the storehouses of the snow? Or have you seen the storehouses of hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? Now remember, God's answering Job's complaints here. Job is complaining that the world isn't run the right way. And God poetically says, well, there's a storehouse for snow and hail, and it's being saved for a day of battle and war. So somehow God preparing for a day of battle and war is part of his answer to Job's complaint. And so hail here is not just a natural occurrence, but it's like ammo that's stored up in this context. And it wasn't uncommon in the Bible for God to use hail as part of his judgment on evil enemies. I mean, we saw it in Egypt as the plague of hail was described there. We see it in passages like Isaiah chapter 30, verse 30, where it says, and the Lord will cause his majestic voice to be heard, and the descending blow of his arm to be seen. In furious anger and a flame of devouring fire, with a cloudburst and storm and hailstones, the Assyrians will be terror-stricken at the voice of the Lord when he strikes with his rod. So this hail being stored for a day of battle and war is not a scientific statement about a big silo up in the sky. It's a poetic statement where God describes himself as preparing for the day of judgment on evil. And so this is actually telling us a little bit more about how we can think about God as we suffer, and it seems senseless, and it seems like it's endless. I mean, one, it tells us that God isn't absent and he isn't passive in his stand against evil. Yeah, he's allowing evil for a while. He's constraining evil within his creation for now, but he's storing up the hail, as it were, for a day when he will go to war and finally conquer evil. And this kind of God preparing for war symbolism is all over these speeches at the end of Job. The symbolism of God preparing for battle, and even the symbolism of God speaking from a storm, talks about that coming day of judgment. In fact, at the beginning of Job 38, when God answers Job, it says, then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. And for God's second speech that we'll get to next week in Job chapter 40, it says, the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. God is answering out of a storm here. And again, 12 years ago when I last preached through Job, I thought that all the thunderings and the lightnings and the storms, they were just kind of a raw display of God's power. They were meant to put Job in his place, to remind him of his smallness, to remind him of the grandeur of God, and that's certainly part of it. But all I saw before is that Job is this fault finder and complainer. He needed to stop complaining, and so God kind of scared him with a storm. He took him on this tour of the cosmos and thundered at him to remind him of who's in charge, who has the power, who has the knowledge, and to cause Job to be quiet and to just impress Job again with his power. And certainly, impressing Job again with his power and reminding him of his smallness is part of God's answer here. But also remember that God is kindly answering Job's complaints specifically. And one of Job's big complaints was, there's no limit on evil. There's no limit on evil. There's no limit on evil people. And the hail and the storm, they're part of God's answer. This God speaking from the storm motif is all over the Bible, and often it's describing God as preparing to finally defeat his enemies and then to bring something new in the wake of the battle. Just like a big rainstorm is destructive and shakes things up and messes things up, but then a couple weeks later, everything is renewed and green because of it. God describes himself again and again as being in the storm, ready to bring destruction on evil, but then something new and green in its wake. Listen to this in Jeremiah 23, verse 16. It says, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, do not listen to the words of the prophets who prophesy to you, filling you with vain hopes. They speak visions of their own minds, not from the mouth of the Lord. They say continually to those who despise the word of the Lord, it shall be well with you. And to everyone who stubbornly follows his own heart, they say, no disaster shall come upon you. For who among them has stood in the counsel of the Lord to see and to hear his word? Or who has paid attention to his word and listened? Behold, the storm of the Lord. Wrath has gone forth, a whirring tempest. It will burst upon the head of the wicked. The anger of the Lord will not turn back until he has executed and accomplished the intents of his heart. In the latter days, you'll understand it clearly." So notice how this storm of the Lord is ready to burst with wrath upon his enemies. Nahum 1, verses 2 and 3, the Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The Lord is avenging and wrathful. The Lord takes vengeance on his adversaries and keeps wrath for his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power, and the Lord will by no means clear the guilty. His way is in the whirlwind, in the storm, and the clouds are the dust of his feet. Zechariah 9:14, then the Lord will appear over them, and his arrow will go forth like lightning. The Lord God will sound the trumpet and will march forth in the whirlwinds of the south. The Lord of hosts will protect them. And you see again and again throughout the Bible this imagery of God judging his enemies from the storm, rescuing his people with the storm, and then often something green and new sprouting up in the wake of the storm. You see this kind of thing in Psalm 18, Psalm 29, Psalm 74, Isaiah 27, Joel 3, Habakkuk 3. God keeps painting this image for his people of him being for his people in the storm and against their enemies in the storm. Now remember, one of the things that Job said is that God is crushing me with his storm. Back in Job 9:16, he said, if I summoned him and he answered me, I would not believe that he was listening to my voice. For he crushes me with a tempest and multiplies my wounds without cause. But here in Job 38, God answers Job like a friend from the storm. He doesn't crush Job with the storm. He's in the storm. He's preparing to one day go to war against evil from the storm and defeat the enemies. But God in the storm is for Job, not against him. So look at what we're learning for our suffering. When we go through real trials and real pain, another thing to see is that God is not passive or indifferent toward evil in the world. And then also that the story isn't over yet. That God will one day defeat evil. That is still coming. He hasn't told the whole story already. I mean, sometimes when we're suffering, we can feel that our bad situation is just the end of the story. I have a terminal disease and I will die, and that will define me. I've experienced this life-altering crisis, and that's who I am now. Now my life is ruined. My family problem is looking like it's going to be permanent, and so it consumes my thoughts. This is all my life. This is who I am. This is all it will ever be. But we have to remember that there's more to come in all of our stories. God is storing up the hail, as it were. He's preparing for a day when he's going to put an end to chaos and disease and sin and suffering. He's preparing for that day when evil will be punished, when evil will be fully and finally ended. And then just like the land turns green after the rainstorm blows through, in the wake of that judgment, new life will come. And so for Christians, it sounds corny, but the best part of all of our stories is yet to be told. I mean, we are in the bad part of a story now, the part where there are conflicts and obstacles and opponents and confusion, but the story's not over. And in fact, with all of history, God is telling a story, and this is one of the reasons that evil is still present. At least it's a partial reason for why evil is still present, because a story that doesn't have any obstacle to overcome, that doesn't have any enemies, that doesn't have any antagonists, is not a good story. If the kids go to Narnia and just make snow angels and go home, nobody reads that. Nobody wants to see that movie. Like that's boring. That's not a good tale. But if they go and they overcome a white witch because of the power of a good and not tame lion, that's a much better story. And so in history and in our lives, God is telling a story. And there are antagonists everywhere. But in the end, he's going to triumph. True good will win. His enemies will be defeated. Suffering will end. And in the end, it will all be wound up for his glory and for our good. And so sometimes we can look at our lives and think, my life has been totally ruined by this thing that I'm going through, but the story isn't fully written yet. God's storing up the hail. He's preparing a day for when all of our tattered stories are going to have a new chapter written. And all of those unresolved plot points will be resolved. And when we will begin to worship him around the throne for all eternity and be amazed at the greatest story ever told that he just told with all of history, with all of our lives, and he wound it all up together perfectly for his glory and our good. God is still ultimately sovereign. He still rules over all the times and seasons. He'll still steer it all for his glory and our good. And yeah, as we go through our lives, it just seems like evil's having its heyday. It's having its fun right now. But there's coming a day of battle and war, when the hail of God's judgment will rain down, evil will be wiped out, and new life will follow. So God is speaking from the storm, and he's saying, your story isn't done yet. So if you look at your life and you think, man, I blew my one shot at having a really great family, and you think that defines your existence, it doesn't, because your story's not done yet. If you sinned and you feel like you will always be labeled and identified by what you did, well, not always, not forever. If you blew your chance at choosing a great career, if you've been falsely accused and people believe false things about you, or if you've ruined relationships and they believe true things about you, and you feel like you will always be lonely, you'll always be ruined, if you feel like evil has won, we have a great champion in Jesus who's already crushed the head of the serpent and one day will finally defeat evil altogether. We're just not to that part of the story yet. And now none of these answers mean that we should deny our suffering. None of them mean that we should pretend that our suffering isn't real. But they do put our suffering in its right perspective. They allow us to see the truth, that our suffering has its place in a story that goes on forever. And that there is coming a day of judgment followed by renewal. There's coming a day of battle and war. There is good to come for Christians, for those for whom God is for in the storm. And when you're the ones that the storm is for, rather than the ones that the storm is against, you have a lot to hope in. This is big because we can be going through a bad trial and it can be all-consuming. Where it seems like you have those first few moments where you wake up in the morning, you don't really know where you are yet. You don't remember anything that's going on. You don't know who you are. You've got those few seconds where you're just starting to emerge from sleep, and those are really peaceful seconds. And then you remember what you're going through. And all of a sudden, it just starts piling on again. And you feel like you're carrying it again. The weight comes on again. And the problems can be all-consuming from morning till night. They can be never-ending. It can seem like the problems only grow or like they're a fire that just won't stop until everything gets consumed by them. But the reminder here is that there is coming a day when those things end. And for Christians, even if we die with our problems unresolved, we will rise again. And that life and the resurrection will go on forever. And so that genuinely horrible thing that we experienced will shrink relative to eternity. If in your life you have a crisis that lasts 50 years, once you've been in the presence of the Lord for 100 years, that 50 years feels a little bit smaller. And then 1,000, well, now it's much smaller. And when you've been there 1,000,000 years, that 50-year crisis that was all-consuming and seemed like everything now becomes a much smaller plot point in your life. Again, this is not to make light of problems. This doesn't fix our problems now. It doesn't explain our problems now. And it also doesn't mean that in any way it's a sin to grieve and weep and feel the pain like Jesus did. But this does relativize those problems. It does constrain them, and it does give us some hope as we go through them. And also maybe if we're looking to discern what God's purposes might be in our suffering, sometimes we can discern some of those purposes. Maybe one of the reasons that he just allows life to continue to be so frustrating here is so that we can just go all in again and again on the resurrection of Jesus and the life to come. And maybe our failure to ever achieve the comfort that we're after here in this life is God's gracious reminder to not love comfort and ease here. Maybe it's part of his kindness to wean us from the comforts of this place. So all the futility we experience, all the inability that we have to make life feel stable and secure and easy and drama-free, the inability we have to make all of our relationships thrive, that could be God's grace to us to continually push our hearts and our hopes toward Jesus and toward the eternity that we really do have coming with him. But whatever God's purposes are in all this suffering, we know that what seems out of control and unruly and all-consuming now just won't be forever because God will tame it. Your suffering is a real plot point in your story, and it may define this season, but it doesn't define you. And we know that because the one who rules over even the chaos promises that. We can't get into detail on it, but in Job 38 and 39, God takes Job on a tour, first starting with the constellations, but then he goes to all these different animals, and he mentions 8 different animals, all of which are hard to tame or seem like they're a little bit unruly, but he describes his good rule and his good reign over all of them. He mentions the lions and ravens and mountain goats and wild donkeys, wild oxen and ostriches and horses and hawks. And they're difficult to tame. They behave chaotically. He describes the ostriches not caring for their young at all. But still, somehow, they're all under the control of God. And so what's God showing Job as he's showing him all these animals? He's showing him, like the lyrics of that song that we sing, that this is my Father's world. Well, let me never forget that though the wrongs seem off so strong, God is the ruler yet. That all these strong and untamable beasts are ruled over by God. They look chaotic, they look unrestrained, but God is sovereign over all of them, just like he is over our trials. And so God shows Job his wisdom, his knowledge, his rule over creation, his goodness and provision all throughout the world. He shows him that he's not a God who doesn't care. He's not disinterested. He's not the God who's up there loving to destroy his creation, but he's the wise sustainer of his creation. And Job sees it now. And Job made accusations. Now he's had his day in court. And God has shown him exhibit after exhibit to prove that God is not this random agent of evil chaos that Job had accused him of being, but he's in fact wiser and kinder and more involved than Job ever thought. So we've made 9 observations of the things that God taught Job and things that God teaches us when we suffer. That God is kinder than we expect or deserve. He's attentive to his creation as a good creator. He's far above us, and he can comprehend what we can't comprehend, so we're not in a position to be his judge. That he does allow chaos and evil for a time, but those things are limited. That there still is a lot of good in his creation. That God doesn't just limit evil as a force, but he limits evil people. That God isn't passive or indifferent toward that evil in the world. That the story isn't over yet, and that one day God will defeat evil, which means that your suffering is not your whole story. Now, these are not answers for why you're suffering. In fact, Job never learns why he suffered like he did as we go through this story. But these are truths to help us cling to God while we suffer. So Job has made his case. God has made his case. Becomes clear to Job he lost the argument. And so Job chapter 40, verse 3, it says, "Then Job answered the Lord and said, 'Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once, and I will not answer. Twice, but I will proceed no further.'" So Job says, I'll be quiet now. And the language he uses here is courtroom language. It's the stopping the mouth of your opponent is what happens when they admit defeat, that they have no more arguments. It's true, they can't handle the truth, so they're going to be quiet. They have nothing left to say. Job has made his case that the world is chaotic, that God rules unjustly, God doesn't care. God brings all of these exhibits in his tour of the natural world to show him that just isn't so. And so Job drops his case. But he's not dropping his case because God bullied him like he said he would. He drops his case because God graciously and lovingly proved him wrong. And so Job responds with silence. But that's not God's whole aim. Yeah, I mean, Job needed to be gently put in his place. He needed to be reminded that God is the creator and that Job is the creation, that the humility that was needed to be produced here. But God's going to do more than just silence Job. He's going to give Job the desire of his heart. He's going to bring him back into worship and relationship with God. God's going to speak again, and that's the speech that we'll look at next week. And you'll see that at the end of this, Job will not just be quiet, he'll not just be silent, but he'll be loved. But for now, let's just not forget where this story fits in the broader story of Scripture. Me and Job, we have this story of a sufferer who faithfully but imperfectly endured suffering that didn't make any sense. He got angry at God, he accused God of not caring, of not paying attention, and then you fast forward through the centuries and God does something that really stops the mouths of anyone who would accuse him of not caring or not understanding. He does something you would never expect. He becomes the sufferer. In a sense, he becomes a Job. And when Jesus came as the true and better Job, he suffered perfectly. He suffered faithfully. He never doubted his Father. He suffered even more than Job. Job at least had the limit where he couldn't be killed, but Jesus accepted death in his suffering. These things just happened to Job. He didn't sign up for them, but Jesus willingly took these things on himself. And so when we wonder, why is it that God would allow this suffering? Whatever we might think about God as we go through it, we can't look at Jesus and then accuse God of not understanding, because he has really been there. We can't accuse him of not caring, because he sent his only son. We can't accuse him of not knowing what it's all like. It doesn't mean that we understand everything that he's doing, but because of what he did in Jesus, the true and better Job, we know that we have a God who does love, who does care, and who does redeem. And while the suffering that Job goes through and the suffering that we go through are reminders for us to hope in eternity, Jesus' suffering actually provided that eternity, purchased that eternity for us. Because one of the scary aspects of the storm of the Lord is that if you're one of the Lord's enemies, you're one of the people that hail is stored up for. You're one of the people that the Lord is thundering against. So what if we're his enemy? I mean, that's not great news when we hear about the Lord in the storm, the storehouse of hail. And according to Scripture, because of our sin, naturally we are his enemies. And man, you don't want to be on the wrong side of the storm of God's wrath. But on the cross, God's hailstones were thrown at Christ. God's storm was directed where we never expected it to go. His lightning was sent right into the heart of his son, so that all of those who take refuge in him could know new life on the other side of that storm. And so if we'll turn and believe in him, our eternity is nothing but that new life. But if we won't, if we remain in our sin, if we remain his enemy, if we won't turn and believe in the gracious gift that he gave us in Christ, then these hopes aren't ours. And so the call in all of this is for us to accept the free gift of everlasting life that's ours in Jesus because of what he endured on the cross, because of the death, burial, and resurrection of the true and better Job, the true sufferer who came to bring redemption.